Thomas Dorsey, throughout the 1920s, was a famous singer, writer, and composer of jazz music. But in the early 1930s, he transitioned his career exclusively to gospel music. He describes an account of the most painful experience in his life and career. He wrote, "Back in 1932, I was 32 years old and a fairly new husband. My wife, Nettie, and I were living in a little apartment on Chicago's South Side. One hot August afternoon, I had to go to St. Louis, where I was to be the featured soloist at a large revival meeting. I didn't want to go. Nettie was in the last month of pregnancy with our first child, but a lot of people were expecting me in St. Louis. In the steaming St. Louis heat, the crowd called on me to sing again and again. When I finally sat down, a messenger boy ran up with a Western Union telegram. I ripped open the envelope. Pasted on the yellow sheet were the words, 'Your wife just died.' When I got back, I learned that Nettie had given birth to a boy. I swung between grief and joy, yet that night the baby died. I buried Nettie and our little boy together in the same casket. Then I fell apart. For days I closeted myself. I felt that God had done me an injustice. I didn't want to serve him anymore or write gospel songs. But still, I was lost in grief. Everyone was kind to me, especially a friend, Professor Fry, who seemed to know what I needed. On the following Saturday evening, he took me up to Malonesboro College, a neighborhood music school. It was quiet. The late evening sun crept through the curtained windows. I sat down at the piano and my hands began to browse over the keys. In that room, Dorsey began to compose what would become his most famous song. He then gave the song to Professor Fry, who introduced it to the choir of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where a young minister had recently been called. That young minister was Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. When the choir sang that song for the first time, I imagine the minister's wife is seated on the front row, as minister spouses typically do. In her arms, or maybe sitting next to her, is a 3-year-old little boy, Martin Jr. As the choir sings the song, it soothes the baby boy. And as he grows, he hears it over and over, each time resonating with his spirit. Over the years, it became his favorite song. Fast forward 36 years. That 3-year-old boy is a minister, an activist, and a leader of the civil rights movement. He's arrived in Memphis emotionally and physically drained, but he found strength to deliver an impromptu speech the night before. Now, as the evening approaches, he steps out onto the balcony and sees a familiar face, musician Ben Branch. Dr. King leans over the balcony and requests his favorite song. He asks Mr. Branch not just to play it, but play it pretty. Play it like you never played it before. As he turned to enter into his hotel room, a shot rang out and claimed his life. At his funeral, Mahalia Jackson honored Dr. King's final request as she sang the words to a grieving community and nation. "Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home." No song could have ministered more effectively to the needs of the African-American people and their allies. And I believe no song could have better described the emotional and spiritual condition of the civil rights movement at the time. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Though they were doing what was right and standing for what was right, and though they were on the right side of history, having achieved so much, yet so much work still lying before them, it was only natural at this dark point in history to feel tired, weak, and worn. I think it's safe to say at some point, every person in this building or attending service at home through Zoom, we have all felt the same way. We've all reached a point where we've done the right thing, stood for the right causes, and it has left us physically, emotionally, and spiritually drained. Being on the right side, on the side of progress, has its benefits, but it can also be exhausting. When I was a conservative evangelical, at times when I was frustrated that church attendance wasn't what I wanted it to be, I often thought to myself, the reason we struggle to fill the pews is because of the standards we preach. If I were pastoring a church that didn't dictate a minutia of do's and don'ts, I could easily fill a church. Being liberal, I thought, is easy. Now that I'm a member of a church whose motto is a beacon of liberal religion in Savannah, I've realized that liberal religion is far more demanding. Theology was easy when my church told me exactly what to believe. Reading the Bible was much easier when I thought I couldn't question it and had to take every word literally. Morality was simple when my church outlined exactly what I could do and what I could not do. But liberal religion demands that I develop theology by seeking the truth, not having it handed to me. It requires that I read not just the Bible, but other sacred texts, and that I read them critically. It requires me to act morally, not based on an external code of right and wrong, but by following my conscience. It requires me to do the hard work of thinking for myself. Being socially and religiously progressive requires me to care about other people, to empathize with those who are oppressed and marginalized, and to turn that empathy into action by being an ally. As progressives, we're called not only to recognize our privilege, but to use our privilege to drive change. Marcus Borg, in his book, The Heart of Christianity, challenges the notion of regression or conservatism, and instead challenges the church to fight for social change. He wrote, "The Bible is political as well as personal. Protesting the nightmare of injustice, its central voices proclaim God's dream of justice, a dream for the earth. Criticism and advocacy are grounded in their understanding of the character and passion of God, a God of love and justice, whose passion for our life together is the kingdom of God." Being a progressive thinker makes you an agent of progress, and by definition, progress requires effort. It takes no effort to regress. It takes little more to conserve, but to progress is to further, to move to a higher stage, to reject the apathetic acceptance of the status quo and instead advocate for change, to say it may be this way, but it may have always been this way, but that doesn't mean it always has to remain this way, to do everything we can to make it better. But as grand and glorious as this sounds, being progressive can also be mentally, emotionally, and physically cumbersome. Being progressive is wonderful when we see progress. As a Native person, one issue I care deeply about is the fight against the exploitation and desecration of our identity and culture by schools and sports teams with Native mascots. I've traveled to Washington, D.C., Cleveland, and Dallas to be on the front lines protesting for this cause. And it felt so great when Dan Snyder, owner of the Washington football team, who had vowed that he would never change the name, announced an end to the racial slur the team had been known by. When the Cleveland baseball team announced that their team would also be changing its name and moniker, I was jubilant. Progress feels really good. But it wasn't long before I was reminded that there was still work to be done. The Atlanta baseball team, the Kansas City football team, and countless other colleges and high schools throughout the country. The joy that comes when progress is made only lasts so long before we realize that there is still so much work to be done. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, wrote, "Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not." For those of you who weren't raised exclusively reading the King James Version of the Bible, I'll give you the Clint Tawes version. Don't get tired of doing the right thing. We'll make progress if we don't pass out first. With all due respect to the Apostle Paul, I must say that's easier said than done. Let us not grow weary in well-doing. How can you tell me not to get tired? I don't choose when to feel exhaustion. It just happens. In due season, we shall reap if we faint not. I've only fainted one time in my life, but I didn't have any control over it. As I read this verse, I've asked myself, because now as a religious liberal, I'm allowed to question the Bible. Why would the apostle tell us to do something, or rather not to do something, that we have no control over? As I pondered this question, I remembered another verse written by the same apostle, in which he compares our spiritual life to a race. Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receives the prize? So run that ye may obtain, or run that ye may win. It may be difficult to tell by looking at me now, but there was a time that I was in shape and I enjoyed running every day. In January of 2007, I weighed in at 240 pounds, and so I started eating better and walking every day. After a few months, I started jogging and then running. By July of that year, I weighed 165 and I ran several miles every day. I would start out at Addlestone Library at the College of Charleston, starting with a slow jog down Calhoun Street. And I would run until I reached the waters of Charleston Harbor and then turn south. At that point, there being fewer pedestrians to dodge, I increased my pace. And by the time I reached the magnificent homes along Battery Park in Charleston, I was running as vigorously as my body allowed. Then usually as I passed the Battery, my body would begin to grow tired. And everything within me seemed to be crying out for me to stop, but I would keep on going. And by the time I reached Colonial Lake, knowing I was less than a mile from my starting point and my destination, something would happen. All the pain and exhaustion was replaced by a newfound energy that allowed me to finish my run. Runners call this phenomenon a second wind. When an out of breath and exhausted runner is suddenly able to tap into a source of energy from within and keep on going. I believe there's a spiritual equivalent to the second wind, a source of renewed vigor and energy that we can tap into in times of emotional and spiritual exhaustion. Wind is symbolic in many religious traditions of life and energy. In the book of Genesis, it was the wind or breath of God that breathed life into humanity. Similarly, in the Navajo tradition, after the creation of the first man and woman, the legend states it was the wind that gave them life. It is the wind that comes out of our mouths now that gives us life. When this ceases to blow, we die. In the skin, at the tips of our fingers, we see the trail of the wind. It shows us where the wind blew when our ancestors were created. But the concept of wind being a force of vitality is not constrained to myths of our origin. In the New Testament book of Acts chapter 2, a verse that's permanently etched into my memory as a former Pentecostal, it reads, "And when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting." Here was a group of people who had taken up a cause to which they had dedicated 2 years of their lives. They had watched as their leader, their teacher, and their friend was crucified. They were hiding out, unsure what, if anything, to do next. Was the movement over? Was it time to go back to their fishing boats? But gathered together, they found a second wind that energized them to go on and advance the teachings of Jesus. How can we today find our second wind? Number one, I believe we can find our second wind by recognizing what is already within us. When I was running in downtown Charleston, I didn't find my second wind by eating a protein bar mid-run. The energy was already within me. I just had to tap into it. The Gospel of Thomas, an ancient text lost for years until its discovery in 1945, includes a saying of Jesus that's not found in the New Testament canon. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what is within you will destroy you. So much goodness already exists within you. Bring it forth and let it save you. Whether you bring it forth through prayer or meditation or yoga, or by taking a walk on the beach or in the woods, maybe through painting, sculpting, or writing songs, poems, or pouring your heart into a journal. For me, meditation isn't sitting on a yoga mat in my living room, but sitting in my car on a long ride by myself, listening to powwow music. That's where I can find what's deep within me. It doesn't matter how you do it, but reach within yourself and bring forth what is within. Number 2, recognize that we are not running alone. The year that I lost a significant amount of weight and began a daily practice of running, my brother came to visit me that summer. At the time, he was a Marine Corps drill instructor, so he was used to running long distances. He and I decided to go for a run together. As we ran and talked, eventually I got tired, but I was determined to keep running as long as he was running. I didn't know it at the time, but he also was tired. But as a Marine, he was not about to be outdone by a civilian, especially if that civilian was his little brother. So we both kept on running. My strength was his strength, and his strength was my strength. My endurance was his endurance, and his endurance was mine. Gaining strength from one another, that day we ran further than we had ever run before a single time. And we can too find strength from those around us by realizing we are not running this race alone. As Unitarian Universalists, we use the word covenant a lot. The word comes from the Latin convenire, meaning come together. In my church, as part of the service, we recite our affirmation of covenant. A little bit different, slightly different from what you all recite, but mostly the same. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. The work of social justice would not only be arduous, it would be impossible if we were doing it alone. We all want to live in a better world, and if we could, we would all be actively involved in every cause, but we simply cannot do it all. As a progressive, I can barely keep up with which companies I'm supposed to be boycotting right now. And if I commit to every boycott that comes across my Facebook feed, I would have to move to the woods and live off the land. In the work of social justice, anti-racism, and equality, there is so much work to be done, more than you can do. But fortunately, you don't have to do it all. You're joined in covenant with the other people in this room, with those at home on Zoom. You're joined in covenant with my church in Savannah and with you churches all across this nation and across the world. We are all doing this work together. One of the most unifying and empowering experiences I ever had was at the 2009 National Equality March in Washington, D.C. The speeches were rousing and powerful, but the highlight of the day was when the Gay Men's Chorus of Washington, D.C. began to sing the song Aquarius. When they got to the part of the song that says, let the sun shine in, every person there joined hands and we all began to sing the song together. It was one of the most beautiful sounds I have ever heard. I am not a great singer, and no doubt there were thousands of other mediocre singers all around me. The covenant that binds us together is much like singing in a choir. It's okay if I can't hold every note in perfect pitch and tone. Just sing the notes you can sing and sing them the best way you can. You are in covenant with a choir of people. We don't all sing the same way, but we're all singing the same song. Together, our song is beautiful, and together our song is powerful. So keep singing the song of equality. Keep singing the song of justice, even when your voice is faint and exhaustion grips you. If we reach within ourselves, if we reach out to those who surround us, I believe we too can hear the sound as of a rushing mighty wind. When we are tired, when we are weak, when we are worn, we can find our second wind.